Mountaintop Studios, the developers behind Shroud's game called Spectre Divide, announced that just 7 months after the game entered closed beta, they're throwing in the towel. They're shutting down their tactical 3v3 shooter, and what makes this even wilder is the fact that this news is breaking just 2 weeks after Spectre Divide launched their Season 1 Flashpoint that finally brought the game over to consoles. Like, think about it for a moment about how crazy that sounds from the perspective of a console player. Like, this game just came out on PS5 and Xbox, you just got the chance to start playing it, and they're already taking it away from you. So Mountaintop Studios came out with this post on their Twitter X where they confirmed that the new Season 1 of Spectre Divide, which was supposed to be such a huge update that they were actually calling it Spectre 2.0, just didn't meet the numbers that it needed in order to keep the studio afloat. So it says, we were optimistic about the first week. We had around 400,000 players play, with a peak concurrent player count of around 10,000 players across all platforms. Since the PC launch, we stretched our remaining capital as far as we could, but at this point, we're out of funding to support the game. This means Mountaintop will be closing its doors at the end of this week. The wild thing about this statement, though, is that according to Jake Lucky, Mountaintop Studios raised $30 million in funding in just the last year alone. And it's speculated that ever since the studio launched in 2020, they burned through $80 million total working on Spectre Divide. So the fact that this is an $80 million project is just crazy to think about when you compare it to what the game actually is. Now, don't get me wrong, Spectre Divide isn't really a bad game whatsoever, but $80 million? Does that qualify it as a AAA game? Well, I guess you also have to consider how much they paid Shroud to promote Spectre Divide and start calling it his game, which apparently some developers actually had an issue with, but, you know, we'll get to that. So it says here, we expect to take Spectre offline within the next 30 days, but we plan on disabling new purchases and refunding money spent since Season 1 launch. So anything that was spent before Season 1 launch, you know, before 2 weeks ago, no refunds, unfortunately. Now, I actually got the chance to test out Spectre 2.0 before they launched. I got an invitation from the studio themselves to play with other creators, and I got into a few matches with some people from Mountaintop Studios as well, you know, so I was playing alongside one of the developers, and I gotta say, when it says here in this post that this has always been a passion project for us, born out of love for this genre, yeah, I could tell straight away that this is probably like one of the most passionate dev teams I've ever seen. But if this is your first time hearing about Spectre Divide, well, honestly, I wouldn't blame you. You know, the game didn't exactly break any records on Steam whatsoever, but basically it was a 3v3 search and destroy tactical shooter where your character could take different sponsorships, and that was basically the different abilities that you would take into the match. So it was a class-based hero shooter, but the twist was that there was this duality mechanic inside of Spectre Divide where you can control 2 bodies with 1 consciousness, and you were able to swap between the bodies mid-match. Because of that mechanic, well, you had the potential to create some really interesting plays and outsmart your opponent, but the reality of the situation is that most of the time people would just use the second body as a second life, and while it was kind of awkward how your inactive bodies were just chilling there, you know, in the middle of a combat zone. So for it being a tactical shooter with a fresh new twist, well, the twist itself was kind of just weird and awkward. The whole meme around Spectre Divide was that because of the way the duality mechanic worked, it felt like you were playing a Valorant game mode where everybody was just playing Yoru because of his teleportation technique. So unfortunately for Spectre Divide, on top of it being stuck with the label of being Shroud's game, you know, instead of being its own thing, Spectre Divide also got hit with the label of being a Valorant knockoff. So this is where Spectre 2.0 was supposed to come in and change everything, because Season 1 Flashpoint wasn't just like a few patch notes here and there alongside a new battle pass, you know, it was a complete rework and improvement of a lot of the core mechanics in the game to try to rebrand themselves as a solid contender in the tactical shooter genre, not just a knockoff game being pushed by some streamer. So some of the changes that they made was making the gunplay snappier, they changed some of the way the weapon selections with your characters in the Spectre worked, they added sprinting and made the maps a lot more fast-paced. You know, if you actually take the time to go through the patch notes, you can see that it's just lines and lines of so many things that they changed to the game, and well, you know, the reason they did that was because Spectre 2.0 really was their last Hail Mary to try to save the game before the studio shut down. And while obviously we can see that the game failed to bring in enough players to save the game in the end, well, at least we can say that they went down fighting. You know, they really tried their hardest to make something work in the end, even though it was a complete bust. I just think that one of the major issues that really screwed this game over was how the marketing was handled with Shroud. I suppose that if you wanted to attach any influencer to your game, Shroud would probably be your guy. You know, 11 million followers on Twitch, is the staple FPS streamer, and the one whose audience would most likely be willing to check your game out. But things just got way too out of hand with this whole Shroud's game situation, where he started calling it his game like he was part owner of the company or something, or was one who was actually developing it, and then people were saying like, oh no, Shroud had more of a consultancy role in the company to give give feedback to the developers, but because he only played it a handful of times before he just dropped Spectre Divide completely and never played it again, well, that's where the rumors started going around that he really just got paid a bag to put his name on it, and that's it. And the thing with having a streamer be the name and the face of your game, well, it makes the game only be relevant as long as the streamer is playing it. So the moment Shroud moved on to go play something else, well, his community just moved on alongside with him. You know, they just left Mountaintop Studios in the dust to kind of just figure things out for themselves. The exact same thing happened with Laserbeam and World Boss, where he hyped up the game that he was working on a couple of times, people got excited, and then the moment that he stopped talking about it, everybody else left too. Also, apparently, some of the developers that worked on Spectre Divide weren't too happy with how the game ended up being labeled as Shroud's game, because in a very long post made by someone at the company called Brodrian, they were pretty clear with stating that this wasn't Shroud's game. You know, Spectre Divide was the result of years of hard work from so many people who were passionate about it, and calling it his game just didn't do all the behind-the-scenes hard work any justice. It's safe to assume that a lot of people at the studio were pretty dissatisfied with the narrative that was surrounded with the game and how it ended up getting labeled as Shroud's game instead of being, you know, Spectre Divide, instead of being its own thing. It says here, it hurt deeply when it became clear that our initial PC launch simply wasn't good enough to make that magic real to a large audience. We knew we had a long way to go, and I wish we could have done more to communicate transparently at the time. It hurt a lot more to see what was special about the game get totally overshadowed by other narratives. It kills me that so many people will never know of Spectre as anything more than Shroud's game. Spectre Divide was not Shroud's game. I feel bad for each and every person who only ever got to know it as Shroud's game. They were never given the chance to see what I got to see. And honestly speaking, I don't know who exactly in the marketing department was the one who greenlit the idea to have Shroud start calling it his game, but that decision made it almost impossible for Spectre Divide to be seen as anything else other than just a famous streamer's side gig at the end of the day. And even with all that work that they put into Spectre 2.0 to give the game a breath of fresh air, unfortunately the damage was already done. So already from really early on, from the get-go, the people at Mountaintop Studios are pretty screwed. I mentioned this the last time I talked about Spectre Divide, but the developers had come out with a statement back then where they emphasized that the fact that even though the concurrent player numbers were nosediving with how everything was handled, the game wasn't really dead, nor were they planning on shutting down the servers or stopping the updates. I kind of figured that they were already in financial trouble back then and just didn't want to state the obvious, but you know, the fact that they had to come out with that statement in the first place was pretty telling to the community that things were just not going well, and now we're seeing the end result of that. So unfortunately, that's the end of the tactical 3v3 shooter Spectre Divide. The developers already mentioned that they're not planning on releasing a standalone version where you're able to host your own servers. All of those years of hard work, all those late nights, all that commitment from the team at Mountaintop Studios, all for a game that nobody will remember a year from now. That's just the nature of the business when you're talking about live service games. You know, I'm sure Shroud will do just fine. You know, he got his bag and he can keep doing his thing. But with hindsight being 2020, we can think about it like this, you know, you came out with a Valorant and CSGO type of game with a mechanic that wasn't really groundbreaking or revolutionary. You tied it all to a streamer who dropped the game after his content obligations were met, and even with the $80 million budget that the game supposedly had, it still wasn't enough to give you more than a 30,000 concurrent players on Steam. So I guess we'll just have to take Spectre Divide and add it to the pile with the rest of the dead live service games, which really sucks, you know, because at least if it was a single player game, even if the studio dies, even if the game flops entirely, you can still go back and enjoy it every now and then. But Spectre Divide will be gone forever, and the only thing you'll have to remember it by will be gameplay videos on YouTube. And that's about it. But anyways, guys, that's all I really want to talk about with you. So yeah, thank you guys for watching.